Okay, so you're welcome, folks. This is Positive Life. We're doing an interview with Peter Crone for the next edition of the magazines, the autumn edition. It'll be
Yeah.
out in September, and the universe totally transpired to make this happen. So I'm delighted it's happened, and he's here in front of me, Peter Crone, on his holiday. So we're going to keep him fairly sweet and do a quick one if we can. So Peter, you're very welcome. Great to have you, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And as I said, there definitely seems to be something in the air that this is the perfect coincidence of events for this to happen.
I wanted to get straight into it with you because relationships, funny enough, is the theme of the autumn edition.
Okay.
And you're kind of, I know you had grief in your life, but then obviously the relationship breakup came to you. So what I wanted to ask you was the perspective that it's been well heard at this point, obviously, but what I wanted to ask you was that incredible perspective that you developed and enabled you to see things totally differently. Like there is no real loss. Okay. The loss
Yeah.
is purely human. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you, are you kind of coming from a perspective of total oneness? Is that what you step into when you realize there is no loss?
Yes, to a certain degree. I think it's sort of for me, particularly with that story of loss, my parents dying when I was young, and then, as you said, having that sort of first glimpse of what I thought was love at the ripe old age of 28, as little as I knew what love was then. Um, I think it was a couple of things. One, it sort of helped to mitigate and reconcile that narrative of loss that my parents that I'd lost them, right? Obviously, it's a heavy grief and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Um, but it just changed that whole dialogue that left me feeling like something was missing, right? That I'm now lacking something. Um, so that was huge. But then there was a certain degree of real surrender to the nature of life itself, which includes birth and death as part of the duality, right? And so there was just this profound acceptance that I had that, as the old adage goes, no one's getting out of here alive, and whilst we all have our sort of subjective preference of how things unfold, you know, um, I guess I just really understood that it's not up to me per se when these big events happen like birth and death. And so that just gave me an immense amount of freedom and relief that albeit I can miss my parents and I love them dearly and they were probably the best, mum and dad I could have ever wished for. My mum obviously was very short-lived. I was only 7 when she passed. But my dad just loved me unconditionally, and I couldn't have asked for a greater father. So, albeit, I've often said I only had him for 17 years. I've got friends who've got their father for 70, 70, and they don't experience anywhere near the amount of love and kindness and affection and support that I got from my dad. So, yeah, it was multiple fold, but it was very profound to recognize that the narrative of loss is what creates the suffering. There's a certain degree, of course, of natural grief when someone dies, but the loss is what creates suffering. You may have heard me speak about the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is an inevitable part of being human. We're going to physically hurt ourselves, but suffering to me is sort of, at least when you get to the realization, it can be mitigated and it becomes unnecessary.
It actually leads me to my next question. Is suffering, do you feel necessary for us to evolve? Because it seems to be the precursor to a lot of people evolving. And is there a point where and I can get a feeling of the answer bubbling in the background as I ask it, but do you feel like you yourself are practicing this all the time? Do you feel you may have transcended the need to suffer at this point in your life when something occurs?
It's a beautiful question. I think it is. It reminds me, as you probably know, I speak in quotes. That's going to be the format of my first book, is quotes that I expand on because most of them are pretty sort of thought-provoking and profound. But the one that comes to mind with regards to the first part of your question is that heaven is a place on earth. You just have to go through hell to get there. And so suffering in this case being synonymous with hell. So I think it is a necessary part, and I would also say to some degree an unavoidable part of the human arc of being here on planet Earth. And I would even assert, without getting too esoteric out of the gates, that planet Earth is the dimension within which we get to reconcile our limitations, fears, and constraints, right? So there's a certain degree of like almost psychological and emotional resistance that is necessary, kind of, I call it like a sloughing of the calluses that have built up on a soul, that we need some adversity, we need some trials and tribulations to be able to pull off those scabs that hide the divine, limitless, sort of timeless, boundless being that we are. So I think it's unnecessary. And whilst I don't want to tempt fate, I'd say you're pretty astute to say that I might have just gotten past it, but I'm not going to tempt fate.
I suppose what I felt into as I asked the question was, there's loads of quotes from amazing teachers like suffering really is a choice, and you would hear that when you
Yeah,
were younger and say, well, I mean, how is that? Like life has enforced this on me. But what I
yeah,
feel now in my own life is that when you hear things, have you heard the term negation, whereby like I'm driving my car and useless thoughts come in and they're
yeah,
painful so I'm able to let them go. But when pain comes in, like real pain, have a space for it, have a
yeah.
space there, you know what I mean? So it's like it's almost like you're suffering but you're not, you're aware that you're suffering, so therefore there's a bit of transcendence in that feeling, isn't there?
It's beautiful. Yeah. So that's the distinction that I teach about, being big enough of a being to allow for all of it. And oftentimes, as I got further into my work, I've been doing it for 27 years. So I'd say within the first few years, I came up with a question that I would always pose to myself in the face of any adversity, which is, can I be with this? Right? Sort of may seem like a weird choice of words, but I think based on what I'm understanding in your own work that you've clearly done, can I be with this situation without having any kind of emotional reaction? And so that's what I hear in your making space for, like allowing, which is, I would say, it's a very advanced state for most humans to be in, because most people, through no fault of their own, are just unconsciously reactive, is the term I use. And what I'm helping people become is consciously creative. So you become present in your life, again, more tongue in cheek, which you'll hopefully appreciate. Being Irish, I always share the joy of sense of humor. And I say, for the most part, the only thing of any significance missing from somebody's life is themselves. That's the only thing missing, is just the you, right? Because most people are in this um, subconscious, unconscious state of survival. That's the primordial imperative of every mammal, is just to make it, right? And that's where the suffering resides, because we're under the impression that unless things go the way we want them to go, then we can't be at peace, we can't be happy. So I think what you just articulated is very precise, or very accurate, in as much as we're still going to feel things, right? We're sentient beings. I still have an immense amount of care for life, for people, especially now with my work being around the world. And so it's hard to see when people genuinely are in very difficult positions, whether we call it suffering or actual pain. And so there's that compassion, the sympathy, the empathy. But I think the absence of resistance to it is what mitigates the suffering. We could say that suffering is sort of the resistance to life. And so when we're not resisting things the way they are, then we can still have feelings, but they're more natural, as opposed to things that we're trying to avoid or escape. So that's where you can still, as you said, have the feeling, but you're sort of okay with it because you're not resisting it. You're actually in
Mm.
harmony with life, which is, to me, that is an advanced state of being, where I'm not fighting life anymore. I'm allowing things to unfold in their natural course of events.
You know the way, Peter, the soul, particularly in relationships, and obviously relationships, we're using the broad term, but romantically is really classic, that the
Yeah,
soul sets you up, right, to expose your unconscious stuff. So
yeah,
you might meet a person like that's pretty unconscious, themselves, and then
yeah,
you start to get activated, and you're aware of this, but because you might be in love or you might be feeling such strong emotions, you get a little bit blinded.
yes,
Um, I'm just wondering, do you talk to many people in life now that are on this? You meet a lot of people who are very into this work, and then they might marry somebody who's completely not, or they might date
yeah,
somebody who's completely not. What do you
yeah.
say to those people in navigating those kind of relationships? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think I've been in a couple myself.
Okay.
Um, look, there's a beautiful expression, obviously you've heard it, of namaste, which is the divine in me, recognize the divine in you. And sort of as a play on words, if you turn namaste into no mistake, namaste, no mistake, so even in these relationships where it can be easy for the person who, let's in this case, has done more work, by all appearances, seems to be more evolved, and they've attracted somebody who's still caught in some of their unconscious patterns and constraints. It can seem like the former is, the potential victim of maybe some unnecessary drama and confrontation because the other person isn't awake yet. But to me, that's still a misnomer because you wouldn't have attracted that person unless there was something still unresolved within
Mm,
you.
mm.
So even though if there was some sort of, spiritually evolved scale that people could measure themselves on and say someone who's an 8 out of 10 marries or dates someone who's a 4 out of 10, from my perspective, the divine timing and coincidence of that interaction, whether you ascribe it to love or convenience or lust or whatever it is that has people come together, is nonetheless the catalyst for evolution on both sides. No one's walking around like a Jesus just healing everybody else. There's always growth
Mm.
on both parts. So there's no lost opportunity. It might not run the course of a lifetime. It might not be, a 50-year anniversary kind of story, but it nonetheless will serve its purpose. And as you've heard me say, I'm sure with my most popular quote, that life will present you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free. And so in that case, it could be all sorts of lessons that person's learning. Maybe it is a bit more self-worth that they don't need to attract somebody who's unconscious, or maybe there's also the opportunity for them to learn more compassion and patience with somebody who hasn't done the work. So there's still a myriad of things that that person could learn in a seemingly imbalanced relationship.
It's a very tricky one because the ego can get quite activated in the person who's obviously spiritually evolved.
Oh
And
yeah,
they
yeah,
start to take on this kind of teacher role.
yeah,
And you can spot that yourself because you kind of go, I'm not going, that's a real tricky one because it's bullshit
yeah.
again. It's the same bullshit.
It is. It's just another way of, I said, kind of masking somebody's underlying maybe lack of self-worth. And so they garner value by being the teacher or seeing as the superior one, which can become like gaslighting. And it actually can be a disservice to the person who hasn't done the work because obviously the relationship in that case is dependent on that dynamic of someone being the teacher and the other person being the student. So I think I've seen that with a lot of people who become
Mm.
gurus or teachers or coaches or whatever it is, that they do attract the broken birds
Mm.
because it gives them that sense of worth and purpose as opposed to true partnership and companionship.
And I suppose the best thing to say to someone in that situation is just be what you really are. Don't necessarily
Mhm.
talk about it, don't necessarily teach it. Just be
Yeah.
it with the other person. Would that be your advice to someone like that?
Only if they're asking for it. Otherwise, I wouldn't give advice because most human beings tend to be quite self-defensive.
Okay, okay.
I got so many of my friends are like, dude, just imagine how many people well, you're helping millions around the world, but there's so many more people. Like, can you talk to my friend? I'm like, nope, not unless they want me to, because otherwise I'm going to come up against a brick wall. So, there's a season for everything, right? Everyone's got to be at that place where they're ready to receive and ready to learn. So, but yes, in theory, if all bets were off and everybody was willing to receive and hear what they needed to hear, then yeah, I would ask that person to really look at the degree to which that role as a teacher is something that's self-fulfilling, where they're not looking at their own responsibility or even their own ability to be contributed to. Sometimes people in that position have learned to, as I said, garner worth by always being the one that's got the answers or taking care of everything. It could also be financially. It doesn't have to be spiritually, right? How many men fulfill on that role of taking care of all the material needs of somebody else, only to eventually become resentful or frustrated. So it would be an opportunity to look in the mirror of where are you not honoring your needs or your preference, And simultaneously, as I said, sort of creating a little bit of an inhibition for the other person to grow and become responsible to manage their own needs as well, without you being the care provider.
There's let's talk about love, Peter, because it's a classic, and
Sure.
it's
Yeah. Who doesn't love that?
it's yeah, it's played all around the world, all the movies, all the songs, it's everywhere you go. Sense of loss, all this stuff, so
Yeah.
how to transcend that and really feel into what love actually is. And I'd love to hear, I'm sure I've heard it before, but what your definition of love really is.
Yeah, it's a slippery one because what I've realized as I've matured over time is there's multiple iterations of love, right? And I think if you can really understand that, I think it's in Sanskrit. Like different languages are bound by their own like lexicon of what's available to us to choose in words, right? So in Sanskrit, I think there's 93 words for love, for example. It's like Eskimos have, I think, 30 words for snow, because it means something to them to know the precise conditions because that's their environment, that's their home. So I think where we in the West maybe struggle with love more than most is because we just only have the one word. So it's almost like we're naive, we're not educated. So my first invitation for people is to just consider different types of love. There's familial love, right? Like that's biological, your parents, your siblings. There's which can actually become almost like an obligatory form of love, right? You have to go to your brother's soccer practice, even though you don't want to because you want to, play in the sandbox or learn violin. And, there's sort of we learn that. And I think that can become kind of dysfunctional as we become adults, where the children learned that love was mandatory, and so that can lead to all sorts of, um, issues when people start to become entwined, especially in marriages, where there's this sense of, well, you just have to because we're married, and that
Mhm.
so that to me then is a form of love. I wouldn't say it's the purest. Um, then you could have love that is a parent to a child, that is sort of indescribable unless you are a parent yourself, where, it sounds sort of very dramatic, but the sacrificial type of love that I would do anything for my child, I'd take a bullet for my child. I think where most people tend to kind of hang their hat on love is romantically, right? The illusion of choice, where we fall in love with somebody,
Mhm.
and I think even that expression is quite telling, because I think there is a falling, right? There's a falling from grace sometimes where it becomes messy, it becomes blind. And to begin with, it can become quite lustful, but it is nonetheless a catalyst for our own growth, and whatever we needed to see. I think the love that I would love people or invite people to start to consider is, the rise in love versus the falling in love, where all boats rise with the tide, that in any kind of relationship, familial, professional, personal, romantic, that we use love in the purest form, which is a profound acceptance of all things to do with that other being. Most people don't even know how subtly they constantly make their partners or their family members wrong. It's not like a um, this sort of on the surface, overtly, abusive manner of judgment and criticism, although that can be the case in some families, tends to be more subtle, where you're not accepting of someone's behavior, or you don't like their, body or their choice of language, or, there's this very subtle, insidious way that we can,
Mhm.
as I said, make other people wrong. And so I think, if you can even find that within yourself, there's an opportunity to start to at least dip your toe into love, which, to me is the complete acceptance of another being for who they are, warts and all. Um, it's that profound, truly unconditional acceptance of another being. That doesn't mean that we want to be with that person, right? This is when we now get out of the container of a romantic love and any obligation. But it's like it's a funny expression, but we grant beingness to other humans, right? Meaning we allow them to be who they are, understanding that they have their course of karma that they have to unfold and they have their journey. and we just remove any kind of judgment or criticism. And so that to me is sort of the ultimate form of love. I'm not a particularly religious person. I like to pull tenets from different religions, but I'm always reminded of, Jesus's words when he said, "Forgive them, Lord, they know not what they do." And I think that's about as close as you can get to what I would call unconditional love, although that becomes a bit of a moot statement because if it's not unconditional, then it's not love.
Yeah, yeah, and I suppose, Peter, the awareness that we probably are kind of love in ourselves, if you know what I mean, that
Yeah,
we're already got that divine connection, and then
yeah,
when you meet somebody, rather than looking for love from them, you're saying, "I have this connection. Hopefully, you have this connection. Let's share it." That's a
yeah.
different platform, isn't it?
Very much so. And I think that's also one of, my Instagram alone. Um, there's been many videos that have gone viral with multiple millions of views, but the one that is still sort of standing at the top with 7.5 million views or something was where I was coaching a woman in one of my live events about this very topic, which is she was still pining after a relationship of 20 something years ago where she fell in love with somebody and her love had become personified over there with him. And that's, I think, one of the most easily, to the easiest of traps to fall into, where people sense that their love is out there with the person. And so then what happens is if that person leaves or changes their mind or finds somebody else, the devastation kicks in, right? Because it's like, oh no, my love has also gone. And I think that's okay, it's great for Hollywood movies, but it's not accurate to the human disposition or your true nature, which is love itself. So I think a much more accurate way of delineating those kind of events is that, yes, you could be sad that the person's gone and you can miss them, but you didn't lose anything because they were the catalyst to reveal the love that you were. And so in that case, rather than it becoming grief or guilt, it actually becomes gratitude for the fact that I even had that connection for however long of a period because it was the catalyst to reveal how much love I have to give. And that changes the whole dynamic of what it is to be in a romantic relationship.
It's like there's such a balance in all of these things, there's a flip side to everything, even in the
Yeah.
new age community, you meet people and they're totally onto the divine buzz. I don't need love. I'm cool, man.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
actually, that's a form of kind of bypassing as well, because
Yeah.
human actual activity of love is really to be celebrated.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a primordial need really of all beings, all mammals, is that sense of belonging. And so I have for sure during the course of my life met those who have through their own hurt, their own resignation, their own cynicism, heartbreaks one after the other, decided that, well, no, I don't need love anymore. I'm totally happy by myself. And whilst I get it, I'm sort of just by design very comfortable being by myself, an only child, orphaned at 17. My conditioning helps me to for sure be independent and isolated and live in this silo where I'm more than content. But I think the joy of life, the juice of life is through companionship. It is through, even at times some, rougher seas of discontent and disharmony with somebody so that you can grow, like I was saying earlier, the sloughing off of whatever it is, the karma that's unreconciled is going to show up in a romantic relationship. And, as they say, smooth seas never made a good sailor. So I think in order to be a powerful human being, you need some turbulent weather. And for sure, the best way to get that is in a meaningful relationship.
Absolutely. And I wanted to touch on grief a little bit. There's a similarity when you have a breakup that you do go into a grief kind of process. When we talk
Hmm.
about very significant people in your life, I've observed some people lately people are losing a lot of people lately. There's a lot of death around. Maybe it's my age,
Yeah.
I don't know. But I'm seeing these people really navigate this quite differently. I went to a couple of funerals lately, and like I remember once I interviewed a lady whose son committed suicide, and she told me that she had a deeper quality of relationship with him since he passed, because he was so troubled here that she
Yeah.
felt this
Yeah.
massive connection with this boy now, and
Yeah.
she actually had a fulfilling relationship. So that's like to remind someone of that when they lose the physical person is quite powerful, isn't it? That this
Very.
can probably be deepened. Did you find that with your own parents?
To a certain degree, I think, yeah, because I think the deepening is more to do with, as we spoke at the beginning, a profound acceptance of life, right? It's almost like if you look at the continuum between like complete resistance to life, which is where we're fighting the way things are, versus at the other end of the scale, like a profound acceptance of everything, then in one state, the fighting, you're literally in conflict with life. There's no harmony, right? That's the quintessential expression of disharmony. Conversely, when you're accepting of things, then you're actually in connection with life. So in this case, you know, the woman, and I've helped a lot of people with suicide. We actually have a documentary coming out this year where I'm speaking about suicide and suicidal ideation because sadly it's become so prevalent. But um, when her boy was alive, he would have been in a constant state, you know, of resistance, and that's why he decided not to be here, right? So it's imagine somebody's constantly pushing you away. They're like, no, no, no. That's the energy of someone who's in resistance to life. There's no connection there. You can't actually, you know, quote unquote, fully be with
Mm.
somebody who themselves in a state of conflict and war internally, right? Like again, one of my quotes, I say we'll never have world peace as long as people are at war with themselves, right? So the experience she had is twofold. There's the absence of resistance of her son, but equally during the grieving process she went through, she had to discover a much more profound sense of acceptance of both the passing of her son and for a mum, the guilt that probably was associated with that. So she went through, consciously or not, a series of really deep forms of acceptance, which then actually makes her more available to life. So, as part of that process, makes her feel more connected to everyone, including her son. So that is the sort of continuum of resistance to acceptance or disharmony to harmony, you know, and that's something to be learned for everybody in that process is like, wow, where am I in conflict with my family, my spouse, my children, my boss, my co-workers, you know, my whatever is out there, and where can I sort of drop the quintessential fisticuffs against life and start to find a little bit more of harmony through the embrace and the acceptance of the way things are.
It moves us nicely now to kind of human evolution because there does seem to be a kind of a thinning of the veil, you know, a kind of a multidimensional feeling floating around. Humans really kind of waking up and saying stuff that's, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm surrounded by a nice community, so I obviously get to hear a lot of really cool stuff. But I
Yeah.
am seeing, you know, kindness, like in everyday life. It's quite extraordinary. Are you feeling, are we in a period of evolution? I mean, everybody says we are, but are you really excited about where humans are going?
I am. I think in the dualistic container that we live in, as much as there is acceleration of awakening, realization, waking up, and with that comes obviously more love, harmony, and vitality. I think simultaneously on the flip side, we also get to see, you know, the counterpart, you know, which
Mhm.
can be seemingly also accelerated disharmony and abuse and rage and war, you know. So I think it's one of the unavoidable aspects of this dimension is that world of duality, the yin and the yang of everything. So I think there's sort of almost like there's a forging of a separation of life where you've got those who are stuck in an old paradigm, which is still built around the premise of fear and limitation and survival and disease, you know, and suffering. And those that are sort of stepping into this new paradigm, which is what I teach about this, literally this new type of human being, that no longer is living within those constraints, but rather stepping into a world of freedom and love and possibility and vitality and joy. Um, so the likes of you and I, obviously committed to that latter experience, are going to see more of that. But I also am aware of the sort of the darkness that is carrying a little bit extra density and weight too over time. And you know, whether we call that a societal cancer or something that will kill itself off, you know, I use the expression of fear will break its own heart. And I think, you know, we see a lot of that happening simultaneously. So I'd like to think that eventually dualistic existence could become slightly more unified, even though that seems like a paradox, where, those still were living in a world of suffering do eventually choose or over time check out, and this becomes more of a nirvana type existence. That might be too, I don't know what the word is, but like, this sort of utopian dream, but nonetheless, it's one I'm sort of committed to.
Yeah, well, it's great to have people, I suppose, like you, committed to that, We'll finish
Yeah.
off pretty soon, Peter. One thing I wanted to ask you was a friend of mine, he's kind of a teacher like yourself here in Ireland, and he asked me to ask you this question. What do you do to melt into bliss? That was what occurred to him. What do you do to access the divine, I suppose, is what he's asking.
It's a beautiful question. And if he's a teacher, he might like my response, he might not. Uh, but I would say it's it's so slippery because oftentimes human questions are generated from a illusory construct, right? Meaning, so his question is beautiful, but it's from the human perspective, right? So, what do I do to melt into bliss or the divine? It's implying that I'm not that already.
Okay.
So that would be my reflection to him is I don't, because I am that. However, of course, I get caught up in the human drama and the external experience of what it is to be here on planet Earth. So it's not that I melt into the divine, but rather being the divine, if I get caught up in the human drama, my opportunity is to relinquish that grip, right? So it's subtle, right? But I'm looking from the perspective of bliss versus the perspective of human. Because whenever I work with anyone, and it's usually quite, profound to witness somebody go through the process with me, and it can be quite expeditious and jarring for people to see someone of 40, 50 years old who suddenly in 20 minutes is getting a glimpse of freedom they never had before. Typically, one of the first responses is like, "Oh my gosh, how do I stay here? I want to have this forever." And so it sort of speaks to that same illusory dynamic that we've become so conditioned to think that we are this meat suit and that we're human. How do I, the human, you know, become the enlightened? But that's the, fitting the camel through the eye of a needle, right? That's the illusion. You can't get there from here. Right? That's a famous Groucho Marx movie back in the day. Someone asked him for directions, and he's a comedian. I don't know if you're familiar with the
Oh,
American.
well, I'm so familiar with him. Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
Yeah, but someone comes up to him, asks for directions. He says, "Oh, you can't get there from here."
That's
It's
a
sort
very
of
Irish, that's a very Irish statement as well.
is
And
right, isn't
yeah,
it? Isn't it great? And
yeah.
so it's sort of that to me is the beautiful reflection, especially for people like your friend who hopefully he'll have a chuckle at that and go, oh, might give him some insight and go, oh, you're right. Like I was asking from the wrong place.
Yeah.
So that's not to deny that we all get caught up in the human illusion. But for me, it's less about trying to get somewhere and rather it's the absence of something, it's the relinquishment of something. And why you may have heard me say before, I don't solve problems, I dissolve them. And so it's the dissolution with the attachment to Maya and the physical world, which then allows me to reside in the essence of the bliss that I already am.
And as Groucho has a great quote with that, he doesn't want to be a member of a club that would have him. Do you know that quote? He would.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, when my friend asked the question, I heard a voice say to me, bliss is another attachment. Don't attach to anything.
Yes.
Just step
Yeah.
in, step out. Like there's actually no difference, I don't think, from the divine's point of view between bliss and suffering.
No,
It's
it's
just
all
an
an
experience,
experience. Exactly.
which
And
is
that's again recently one of the quotes that people have heard me say and that they really seem to be sharing in the interwebs is, it's not about trying to feel better, it's about getting better at feeling.
yeah,
Meaning to
absolutely.
make space for all of it. Yeah, because otherwise it becomes that quintessential chase, the chase for the Holy Grail, as our friends from Monty Python would do. It's sort of like there's somewhere to get to, and that's it's so seductive. But then what it does is it creates suffering now because if you're saying there's somewhere to get to,
Mm.
you're saying where I am isn't it, and that's one of the biggest lies.
That's a big one from Eckhart Tolle. He said that I interviewed him years ago and I asked him about hope. Never give hope to anyone, he said to me, which sounds so controversial. And he said,
Yeah,
because everything's in the now, remind
exactly.
them what they have in the here and now, because the hope
Yeah.
is the projection. I've had such an impact on me. Peter, thanks for joining
Yeah.
us. I just wanted to say that you're going to be speaking in London at the Health Optimization Summit. And I think you're
Yeah.
doing an event in London as well. Are you yourself? Can you tell us
I
about that?
am, yes. I'm doing two of my Finding Freedom events, which I'm really excited about on the 9th and 10th of September. So it's coming up next week.
Wow.
Um, we sold out really quickly for the 10th. We still have some, I don't know when people might hear this. Obviously, the interview itself will be
Yeah.
past, but the 9th has still got some availability for tickets, which will be really fun the Tuesday next week. And then, yes, I'm speaking that following weekend at the Health Optimization Summit. And I'm sure I'm going to upset a lot of people by telling them that they don't need all the fancy gadgets and that true vitality is available to them when they free their mind.
Beautiful. I'll be there actually. I'm going to pop over. I think I'm
Oh, you are? Oh,
yeah, I'm
amazing.
hosting Barbara O'Neill in Dublin, so she's kind of a pal of mine. I don't know if you know her. She's a naturopath.
No, but I'd love to meet her.
Oh,
Yeah.
dude, I'll connect you actually. We'll have a chat over there. I'll come and say hello to you.
Are you
And
so you coming to the event
yeah, I'll
itself?
come to the Health Optimization Summit. Yeah, yeah.
When are you getting to London?
I think I'm getting in on the Friday.
Oh, okay. I was going to say otherwise come to my event, but you'll miss that. Okay. Well,
Oh,
then
you're
let's definitely connect in person. That'd be wonderful.
absolutely. I'd love that, man. And
Yeah,
thanks
and I'd love to
again.
meet Barbara.
Yeah, and I did put a shout out for you to come to Ireland at some point. Do you think that's a possibility next
I
year?
would love to. I know this is embarrassing to say, but having grown up in Dover, studied for 4 years in Loughborough with many a great Irish friend, I've never been to Ireland.
Really, man? Oh my
I
God.
know. Don't hold that against me. I
You'd
know
have a
it's
good crowd. I
terrible.
think we get a good crowd here for you. So let's see. I'll talk to your
Okay.
Cambria, isn't it? Cambria is your guy.
Cambria but yeah, she's now,
Oh, it's
we
a
just,
lady. Okay.
yeah, she was my executive assistant. We just now promoted her to do live events because they've gone gangbusters. You know, people are flying from all around the world. So she's going to be focused. So she would be the one to say, yeah, let's do something in Ireland. That would be wonderful. I'd love that. I love the Irish people. You know, I love golf. Big fan of Rory and all the,
Oh
the
man.
Larrys and stuff. So yeah.
Oh, we'll show you around some cool spots if you come over. Absolutely, man. It's
Okay.
been a real pleasure talking to you. I'm just gonna stop the
Likewise.
recording here and say goodbye to people. Thank you everybody for joining, and we will post this before Peter's event in London just to get the word out there, and it'll be
Amazing.
in the print magazine as well. Thanks
Yeah.
everybody.